Greetings, folks, and welcome back to your favorite podcast, The Africanist. I am your host, Paul Manjai, and today I'm back with a new episode of The Africanist. So please do not forget to follow us on social media. We are on Facebook, X, formerly known as Twitter. We also on Instagram and now on TikTok. Don't forget to follow us on all those platforms. So today we are back with another special guest to talk about the Casamance crisis. Many of you might be familiar with Casamance, which is a part of southern Senegal. And to talk about the crisis in Casamance, which started in the early 1980s, I have the honor to welcome Dr. Mark Deets. Dr. Mark Deets is an assistant professor of African Studies and World History and the director of the Prince Al Walid Center for American Studies and Research at the American University in Cairo. Dr. Deets' research and teaching focus on 19th century and 20th century West African history, especially in the Senegambian region. And his first book, entitled A Country of Defiance, mapping the Casamance in Senegal, was published in 2023 with the New African History series of Ohio University Press. And in 2025, Dr. Deeds' book was awarded the Outstanding First Book Prize by the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, also known as ASWAD. Mark Deeds has also published in many other venues, including in History in Africa, a journal of debates, methods, and source analysis. He published also in the Journal of African History, among other places. Dr. Deeds, welcome to The Africans. It is a pleasure to have you on this platform.
Thank you, Bamba. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
First of all, congratulations on this wonderful monograph.
Thank you so much.
I learned a lot about Casamance and the crisis and also the sensitivity of the topic. But also congratulations on the distinction that this book received earlier this year.
Thank you so much. It means a lot to me that you as a Senegalese recognize some of this history. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. First, can you give us like a summary of the monograph?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So, A Country of Defiance is a term that actually comes from the essay that was written by the Catholic priest, Father Augustin Jamakun Senghor, the former Secretary General of the Movement of Democratic Forces of the Casamance, or the MFDC. And he was writing this essay in 1993 in response to the findings of a French archivist named Jacques Charpy. He entitled it Casamance, un pays de refuge. And so I translated that into English as A Country of Defiance. And the book is what I'm calling a spatial history of the Casamance and of the Casamance conflict. And so, although I do organize each individual chapter chronologically, the book is a little different from most history books in that it's not chronological all the way through the book. It's actually organized spatially. And so each chapter is about a different social space that I assert was an element of this separatist discourse of grievance, a spatial discourse of grievance, if you will, that the Casamance separatists felt was essential to their identity and distinguishing themselves from people in northern Senegal in these kinds of things. And so each chapter is about a different social space. and the ways in which the separatist movement used these spaces and places and place is a very important word here, right? Because like it's the attachment to place that makes these different spaces work as an element of nationalism or separatism, if you will. And so anyway, I go piece by piece, space by space in each chapter, and try to put together the ways in which not only the ways that the separatist movement asserted this kind of spatial discourse of grievance, but then also the ways in which ordinary Casamance in the practices of their lives experienced nationalism and separatism to varying degrees, either identified with this discourse of grievance from the separatist movement or rejecting it. There were many who were just fine with being Casamance and Senegalese at the same time. So I tried to kind of look into all of the intricacies and of that identification.
So, for those of us who are not necessarily familiar with the crisis of
Yeah.
Casamance, how could you explain it to us in terms of what are the causes, what are the demands of the separatists, and what are some of the consequences that resulted from this decades long crisis?
Yeah, so causes and effects are quite complex, but I would start with pointing to colonialism and to colonial cartographic practices as probably one of the most important causes of the conflict. And there's also beyond just the cartographic practices. I mean, some of the social and institutional practices that colonialism brought are also a factor here. So, depending on how far back you want to go, we can go back to the 1400s and talk about the way that the Casamance gets its name, which is actually from a combination of the Mande terms Masa, which means king, and then Casa, which is like the country of the lower Casamance, especially like west of Ziguinchor. And so the Portuguese began to write this down as something, the meaning the Mansa of Casa, and eventually they started calling this kind of like that king's territory or that king's country. So it became Casamance. Uh, but at the same time, there were these pre-colonial African kingdoms that were, in many cases, either somewhat tied to the old Mali Empire and to these Mande societies via trade and religion, and especially Islam, or there were other factors here that drive this, and the arrival of Europeans and the development of trade and the development of Atlantic trade during that time also, of course, has a huge influence. And so, on the one hand, there's certainly a lot of room here for like pre-colonial indigenous groups having a huge role to play in demonstrating their own agency. At the same time that we can acknowledge that this name actually comes from the Portuguese in calling it the Casamance, and yet those words are actually again from these Mande groups, right? So it's that Atlantic story of mixing, of Atlantic mixing. But it really becomes, in terms of how it's being mapped and how it's being administered, the Portuguese continue to be a part of this, but the French and then eventually the British also enter into this. And, of course, the Casamance as we know it today, and eventually as a part of Senegal, this is because of mapping and colonial cartography, especially by the French, but also by the British. I mean, all of these different colonial powers are kind of exploring and mapping all at the same time, although the French and the British are kind of coming into the picture a bit later than the Portuguese. That is a kind of how we eventually get this region. How does it become a part of Senegal? I mean, for that, we have to go really to to French colonialism, and then the decolonial moment that Severina Wanengo d'Alberto has written about so beautifully in her book, L'idée de la Casamance autonome. And she does a wonderful job of kind of providing this sort of legal and intellectual history of how we get the Casamance as a governed space. And yet, I think I spend a lot of time in the book showing not only how the space, even though we get this name and we get this idea of the Casamance from a colonial mapping and colonial governance, it's actually through the resistance to a lot of that from the Casamance themselves, as it is with other people all around Senegal, right, who are going through many of these processes at the same time. They're sort of pushing back on some of this that is going to help bring about these different sort of national and regional identities. And while it's tempting to just talk about different ethnic groups and where they were and where they moved and so on and so forth, I think what we see, and especially in the Casamance, is such a flux of ethnicity and such fluidity and just a lot of mixing going on there.
Hmm.
So that's how I would say that we kind of get this the notion of the Casamance as something that is unique and kind of its own thing, right? And I think that because it's something that is being referred to in these colonial documents, in some ways that's kind of the beginning. And yet again, I want to emphasize that Africans played their own role in this, certainly in relation to those links to the Mande societies.
Excellent. People of my generation, when we hear about Casamance and the crisis, we go back to the early 1980s when basically
Right.
we had the first armed insurgencies. So, how did that
Right.
unfold and how did it impact the remainder of the crisis?
So I think that most scholars of the Casamance conflict would point to the 1970s, and this is kind of going to be the beginning of structural adjustment and things like that. So there's going to be a number of economic factors that are a part of this. But in general, the 1970s is also when, or it's shortly after independence, where we see the development of a tourist economy in the Casamance because of the beautiful beaches along the Casamance Atlantic coast of people, Europeans and others who wanted to come down and spend time on these beautiful beaches in the Casamance. And there, there's this narrative. I think that some might contest this, but there was this narrative that because the Wolof and other ethnic groups in northern Senegal were better at trade and they had more of a history of trade, that they knew how to run these hotels and restaurants and all this stuff that was going to be tied to this tourist economy and developing these beaches and all of these kinds of things. And so there's this idea that all of these people that the Casamance refer to them as Nordistes, or Northerners basically,
Mm-hmm.
that were coming to the South and taking the good jobs in this new tourist economy and seizing land and things like this. I'm not saying that land seizure was necessarily a huge part of this, but it's a part of the discourse, right? It's this idea that you've got these Northerners who are coming down and exploiting the situation in the Casamance, even though it's not their land, they've never been here before, and they're taking all the good jobs in this new kind of tourist economy and this sort of new developmental regime. And so that's the beginning of the grievance, right? I mentioned this spatial discourse of grievance, which is kind of the central argument over these different spaces and places that I look at throughout the book. But it's that discourse of grievance, and it has to do a lot, again, in the mind of the separatists, the Senegalese exploitation of the Casamance. And this extended to some extent, the exploitation of Casamance women, many of whom were taking jobs with French families and elite Senegalese families in Dakar and in northern Senegal. So Vincent Fouché has like an entire chapter about this in his PhD dissertation in talking about these Casamance maids. And of course, they're going to what they think are good jobs in Dakar, and yet that becomes another ingredient in this recipe, if you will, of this discourse of grievance that Father Jamakun and Mamadou Sane, he goes by the name Nkrumah Sane, start to define. And by the way, there are things going on with property. I was saying that like Senegalese are not necessarily stealing land, but certainly the Casamance are saying that or thinking that, partly because there had not been a cadastral survey before. Like there was a degree of mapping and taxation that had not really been there before, or to the extent that the French instituted these things during the colonial era, they weren't fully realized, or things had changed so that they weren't as important by the time we get to the 1970s. Anyway, you have this sort of mix brewing in the 1970s and heading into the early 1980s. That's all about the Senegalese exploitation of the Casamance. And for these Casamance separatists, they look at the Senegalese as no different than the French. This is not me saying this, but yeah, they make this comparison that and Father Jamakun does this very directly in saying that basically the Senegalese just replaced the French as the colonizers.
And Mark, here when they say Senegalese, they exclude themselves in
Right,
that concept of Senegalese does not include
right,
the separatists or Casamance, right?
right. The separatists do,
Yeah.
but I kind of mentioned this earlier. When you start talking to other Casamance, they're fine in saying that they are both Senegalese and Casamance, right? So this is a direct move by the separatist movement. Not every Casamance person feels that way or believes that. Yeah, but certainly this is what the separatist movement would say. And so anyway, you have these issues that are tied to land tenure and a couple of famous cases like I think it was the Soki tour or something like that. A couple of different tourist hotels that the Casamance felt like these things were really being exploited by these people from northern Senegal. So for people who know anything about American history, like it kind of sounds like, these carpetbaggers from the north, the South, the Confederacy had a similar kind of discourse or kind of narrative about people from the north with money coming down and exploiting the region and exploiting the situation of these people in the south.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, that becomes like a very important part of this in terms of the causes. Now the next part of this story is that these separatists, these people who are organizing this, and again, kind of the elites who are leading this are especially in Nkrumah Sane. And then eventually he gets Father Jamakoun to join this effort as well. And they begin having meetings together. And they start meeting at on this soccer field tied to Casasport, which is, as you know, is one of the Senegalese clubs in the Senegalese Premier League in Ziguinchor. And so they start meeting actually on a soccer pitch or, football pitch outside of Ziguinchor. And they did that because it was one of the few places that they thought they would not be detected and would not be bothered by Senegalese police. And so anyway, they started having these meetings and talking about the ways in which they thought that they were being betrayed and exploited by their union with Senegal, and that they needed some kind of autonomy to be able to pursue their own interests. And so those meetings eventually lead to, the formation of what becomes the MFDC, which is actually an attempt to rebirth an old late colonial political party, which was also known as the MFDC, the Movement of Democratic Forces of the Casamance. But it was kind of viewed as a regional party at that time. And in fact, to some extent, there were many different kind of national parties like this that were existing, say in the late 40s and early 50s, that then disappear, just like the MFDC did. Well, the modern movement, which begins, Severine Awanengo Alberto calls it the MFDC 1982, to distinguish that party or that movement from the earlier party from 1949 to 1954. And so anyway, they take on the name of this old political party that existed from 1949 to 1954 that was led by Ibu Jallo and
Emil Bajan?
Yes, it is Emile Bajan. And so that formed this political party. And so they have taken that and they say that now, according to the separatists, those are not two distinct parties. Instead, Father Jamakoun and Nkrimasane merely resurrected from the ashes this party that, had this direct line of continuity from the 1940s all the way up to the 1980s. So anyway, they decided it was during these meetings at this soccer pitch, which is the reason that I have this chapter in the book. It's actually the fifth and last chapter called The Stadium. It was at the soccer stadium that they decided to get together and march in protest against the Senegalese state, what they viewed as the abuses of the Senegalese state. And so the day after Christmas in 1982, they marched from what is supposedly a sacred forest southwest of Ziguinchor, from a neighborhood southwest of Ziguinchor, and they marched into the town of Ziguinchor, and they went to the governor's office, and they brought down the Senegalese flag, and they ran up a white flag to protest the idea of Senegalese sovereignty over their region. And so that was kind of the beginning. There was there were no deaths on that first day in 1982, although I did talk to an informant who had his fingertip shot off. So I think there were some shots fired, but really the real violence comes later. And after this demonstration, of course, the Senegalese state begins to track down some of the separatists and begins arresting them. In fact, they had an intelligence tip that this was going to happen a few days before the separatist march into Ziguinchor. And so they had already arrested Father Jamakoun and Nkrimasane. Yeah. And so anyway, that's kind of a very long story for, the kind of the causes and how we get there and what the story is leading up to that separatist march. And like I said, the Senegalese state begins clamping down on this. at the end of 1982 and then throughout 1983, they're tracking down separatists and arresting them. And then eventually there's going to be another Sacred Forest March in 1983, but that one's going to be much more violent. The first one, Father Jamakun really wanted to try to keep it peaceful. In fact, they had a group of women leading the march out in front of them and pouring cool water on the ground to try to symbolize how they were trying to, keep the tempers from flaring and to keep the fiery passions down surrounding this issue.
Now, the title of your book foregrounds defiance. So, how does this concept of defiance operate not only as a resistance to colonial authority, but also as a cultural and intellectual stance within Casamance?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bamba. I mean, as somebody who did not grow up in the Casamance, I'm not from Senegal originally. So, I'm learning about all of this very quickly as, a white American man, adults, and learning about all of this history. I began to hear, and by the way, I lived in Dakar from 2005 to 2007 as a diplomat working at the U.S. Embassy in Dakar. And I would often hear this discourse or these things about the Casamance as like a country of rebels or a country of rebellion. But in this case, again, the term that Father John McCoon used in French was le refus, which originally I was kind of translating as refusal. And I mean, I think literally that's probably what that means. And yet, I think that the word defiance is a much better term in English for what Father Jamakun was trying to express. And, in a way, he's claiming a sort of essentialism for the Casamance, and saying that the Casamance has never accepted a foreign ruler over them, that even under French colonialism, that there was a respect or a certain amount of autonomy that the Jola especially exercised. So, a lot of this is also tied to ethnicity. And there is this idea of supposedly a cultural linkage between the Casamance and the Jola people. And yet there are many other people in the Casamance besides the Jola. It's not just the Jola, it's the Mandinka, the Balanta, the Mancanya, and the Pole or Fulani. Many others who are in the region and living in the region and a very important part of it. And yet in this lower Casamance region that we're talking about, which I would say basically anything west of Seju, then we're talking about mostly Jola areas, right? But of course, you're going to, even in Ziguinchor, in Bignona, you're still going to meet Mandinka, you're still going to meet Balanta, Mancanya, you're still going to meet many, many other people. And yet, the Jola, because they are the majority ethnic group in that region, they very much get tied to this idea of being rebels. And it's often portrayed as something that's natural. It's something that's inborn to them. That it's historical for them. It's traditional that they are rebels. And by the way, Father Jamakun doesn't turn that away or turn that down. Instead, he builds on it and he says, yes, we have this history of never succumbing to imperial exploitation. And so, yeah, there is a long history, like you were saying, and so it goes beyond defiance in the Casamance and for the Joel. It's not just about open rebellion. It's like it's a history of refusing to be mapped by somebody else,
Mm.
to be colonized, imperialized by somebody else. And so but it becomes this part of the culture, especially among the Jola, that they're very proud of. Like a cultural and an intellectual posture that they refuse to be subdued. And they also, what I'm arguing is they refuse to be mapped. And so whether it's the colonial state, whether it's the MFDC, you have a lot of variety, a lot of diversity of various people in the Casamance and in Senegal writ large, who in various ways, refuse to be mapped. They refuse to be defined in only one way. They're fine with kind of these very plural ways of being and living. And so, my argument is that it's this kind of refusal by ordinary, sort of everyday Casamance to not let there be any single cartographic or ideological project that defines the Casamance. And that ultimately, that's why we can think of it, or at least why Father John McCoon said we should think of it as a country of defiance.
Excellent. So, in your research, how did oral histories and local narratives challenge or complicate the official maps and documents produced by colonial administrators?
Well, as I'm sure you know, there are plenty of historians of Africa who have a lot more oral histories than I had for this book. I had almost 40, I think it was 38 oral histories that I collected during my research. And they were so not a huge number, right? Again, I know Africanists with like over 400 oral histories in a book like this length. But those 38 or 40 oral histories were so important to my thinking about the book and what is actually in the book, right? So there's what actually made it into the book, but then there's also all of that sort of background knowledge, all of the sort of cultural things that I never would have picked up on. I never would have thought about if I hadn't gotten out of the archive and gone and talked to people, right? So, I mean, I think that there's a place for both kinds of research. But for me, this oral history research was so important in terms of complicating like the clean narratives that one tends to get from colonial reports and official maps and that kind of thing. And you don't get a sense for the culture of a village or the importance of a sacred forest and the uniqueness of a sacred forest, which these are things that I talk about in my chapter on the forest. You don't get that unless you get out and talk to people. But also because of these oral histories that I collected, I talked to so many people who said, yeah, that sacred forest is really important to me, but I don't think that means I can't be Senegalese. Yeah, I'm a supporter of Casaspor, and I wear the green jersey in the stadium, but I can be Casamance and Senegalese at the same time. And so, it's that kind of those things that I would never get just from reading colonial documents in the archive in Dakar. The only way that I could get those were to go out in not only into Ziguinchor, but I spent a lot of time around Bignona and also out towards Usui. and kept skiing and places like that, talking to a lot of people and just hearing their stories and hearing how they, because the Casamance conflict is such a recent, in some ways, contemporary conflict. I was able to find a lot of people with a lot of memories of this, right? But just very quickly, Bamba, let me tell you a quick story that I think really illustrates the importance of these oral histories to me. I was in a village just west of Ziguinchor and talking to this old man and his family. And by the way, it's interesting. There's usually kind of a process that would take place when I would show up as this, foreign white reporter in one of these, or researchers in one of these villages. And typically it was all the women and the kids would say, "We don't know about that. We don't care about politics. Go talk to that man over there." And usually that man was like one of the elderly, or one of the guys with the most Western education in the village, right? And so I would go and talk to that guy, but sometimes, the women and the children would stay around. And then eventually they would also start entering into the conversation and taking part of the conversation as well. And I discovered that, oh, they did have political ideas. Now, I mean, they weren't political in as much as like being a part of the MFDC necessarily, but in terms of arrays of power, forms of social power in that society, they were certainly political. But anyway, again, to this village just west of Ziguinchor, I was pointed to this certain man with, gray hair and a gray beard and a ball cap. I think he was wearing a ball cap. And I went over and sat down to him, and he was a guy who had been very involved with the Casaspor supporters in Dakar in 1980. And so a lot of people think that the Casamance conflict really began in 1980 with the Coupe du Senegal of Senegalese football. And this was a very controversial match between Casa Sport and Jeanne d'Arc. And I tell the story in the book that, this is kind of the beginning of this idea of the Senegalese. They're a bunch of cheaters. They betray us all the time. And like one of the examples that they use is this football match between Jeanne d'Arc and Casa Sports for the championship. I think Leopold Senghor was there watching. And anyway, the match basically came down to a goal that where the Casaspor guy was supposedly, I forget I have the name of the book, but I don't remember it off the top of my head right now. But a defender tackled a guy from Jeanne d'Arc who was taking a shot in front of the goal, and it was depending on who you get to talk to, it was either like right inside the box or right outside of the box. And the referee said that it was inside the box, so that means that that Jeanne d'Arc gets a PK. So anyway, they line up the teams for this penalty kick, and the guy, and again, I have the names in the book, but the kicker took the kick, he missed, but the referee blew his whistle again and said, "Hold on, hold on. You took the kick before I blew my whistle for everybody to like be ready to start, and so we have to do it over." And so he set it up and gave him a second chance. And this time he scored, and the Jeanne d'Arc won the game 1-0. But as the referee was trying to make his way off the field, Jules-François Bocandé, who was kind of the star striker for Casa Sport at the time, caught up with the referee and kicked him in the groin.
Yeah.
And then that ignited this big melee, this big riot on the field. We had got security forces out on the field trying to get people to stop, and the Casa Sport supporters had also shown up prepared. I mean, they had like leg weapons, like knives and machetes or clubs or whatever. And so it was this really horrible thing. But anyway, when I was talking to this guy in this village west of Ziguinchor, he said I was asking him about that moment, and he said, no, the referee wasn't trying to screw over a Casaspor. He was just a human being, and he made a mistake. I said, well, was he in the box or out of the box? And he goes, oh, he was, he was out of the box. Like, he's like, yeah, the referee made the wrong call, but he was just a human being and he made the wrong call, but he's human. And that sort of blew my mind. I know that sounds really simple, Baba, but it just, I had heard so many people telling me what a travesty this was and how the whole separatism movement and all the entire Casamance conflict started in this moment. And yet here was this guy who played this very important role in this club of the Casaspor supporters, car, who's sitting there in this village telling me, no, it wasn't intentional. No, he wasn't trying to screw us over. No, he was just a human being and he made the wrong call. And so that was kind of the beginning of me thinking, okay, I haven't heard that before. I really need to listen. I need to listen closely to what these people are telling me. And that was like kind of the first thing that began to provide kind of an alternative narrative for me. And so I began to seek out that more and more and to listen for those things and kind of seek those things that, went a little bit against this very public discourse from the MFDC about this discourse of grievance against the Senegalese all the time.
Excellent. Excellent. Now, your work intersects with broader debates about the humanities. So, what does studying Casamance through maps and texts reveal about the role of the humanities in understanding African history today?
Well, I mean, I think to some extent, what I was just saying about getting out of the archive and talking to people and hearing this sort of alternative viewpoint on this history, I think that's, I mean, that's an important place to start. But I think look, the conflicts and the region's identities are not going to make sense if all you do is track troop movements and give me economic statistics. Like you need this sort of spatial cultural history to help us understand the meanings of these spaces and places for the people on the ground. And you're not going to get that out of a colonial document, very rarely anyway. And so spatial history, like all histories, it's not objective. Indeed, space is not objective. And so what I've tried to do, and I credit Ray Craig at Cornell with helping me do this, was to read maps and other sorts of cartographies and other sorts of colonial documents against the grain somewhat, but also just different, right? And again, I wouldn't be able to do that if I didn't have all of that time on the ground in the villages talking to people. And so that when I would go back to the colonial documents and I read these documents and see the maps, I would be able to pick up on new things that would tell me something different about this map and about this space or place than I would have if I didn't talk to people. But all of this certainly showed, all of my program at Cornell with Ray Crabe and others, Judy Byfield and Sandra Green and Ziad Fahmy, they were my advisors there. And I realized that maps were not neutral tools, that they were arguments about space, that they were things that could be negotiated and kind of debated, which I never thought of a map that way until I started studying at Cornell, and especially again this field that I did with Ray Craig. So I think that's one of the things that I would say. I think the other thing, working with Judith Byfield, I looked so much at gender. Judy was always asking me, okay, where's the gender in this? Like anything that I wrote, any research paper that I did, any essay that I wrote, that was almost always her question, like, where's the gender? And so I began to look at the ways that not only that the ways that mapping worked, but also the ways that that mapping was gendered in the first place, and the ways in which thoughts about space and place really were tied to gender. Kind of like that story that I told you a little bit ago about like walking into a village and having all of the women tell me that they didn't know anything about politics and that they wanted me to go talk to the most educated man in the village. But again, when I would stick around and hear these women start talking about various parts of their lives, sometimes dire really directly tied to politics, other times not so much, but again, they're still even in talking about their families, even in talking about their husbands, there are these arrays of power that, are readily apparent that, could not be ignored. So, again, I just think that those, for me anyway, those oral histories are just so important, and, to make these kinds of links in the humanities that you're talking about, these sort of, in some ways, some of this stuff is kind of, to some extent, sort of cross-discipline to take, some of the economic history and some of the political economy, and then be able to tie that to some of the spatiocultural histories that I was talking about. It's not as if to do the spatio-cultural history, I had to ignore the economic history or ignore the, economic colonial exploitation, of colonial rule, right? But, for those things to inform each other in trying to make this argument about space and place, which is, what I was trying to do ultimately, and then to show the ways in which ordinary people either, responded to that and thought about that. Because, I mean, if you read much of Father John McCoon's writing, certainly in, Pays de Refuge, in that essay that I mentioned, that, he wrote in 1993, it's readily apparent all these, these spaces and places that I talked about. You can find it suffused throughout, that essay. But also, when I would go into the villages and talk to people and collect these oral histories, I would hear many references to the same things, the same spaces and places, but in different ways. And so, again, that oral history work that I did was just so important, for me personally, but also for the book. And I think, so anybody who's interested in humanities and what it means to be human and the diversity of that experience, I think they would be interested in that.
Excellent. What was it like doing research for this book? What were your breakthroughs and obstacles that you faced in the process of researching this book?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, I think that I had doors opened and I had doors closed, partly based on who I was. I do think that the Senegalese government, again, I was a diplomat there from 2005 to 2007, and I think the Senegalese government was aware of who I was and that I was there, and to some extent what I was doing. And, I wasn't arrested or anything like that, but I think, and I'm not saying that necessarily that I was under surveillance all the time either, but I'm just saying, like, they were aware, and
Mhm.
I think they were paying attention.
Because it's a very sensitive topic, Casamance.
It is.
Whenever you talk about it in Senegal, it's very sensitive, right? So
It
the
is.
government definitely is very careful about what is said or what's being done regarding this topic.
Right. Yeah. No, it absolutely is. And I mean, I was also aware of my positionality as a white Western man and a former diplomat coming into the country and doing this research in basically Senegalese internal affairs, right? Like if anybody wanted to tell me to just scram and go away, they could have. And, I did talk to a number of people who were very nervous to be talking to me. As far as I know, I didn't endanger anybody. Nobody was harmed from any of the research I did, but I was also very careful about that. I had taken a course at Cornell on human subject research and the legal ramifications of that. In fact, like I didn't cite any names in my book, except for those people who signed an agreement basically saying that they didn't mind having their being named as a part of this human subject research. And for the most part, those people were elites and people who, like, the Senegalese government already knew about them, right? I mean, I'm talking about some guys who are connected to the MFDC who'd already done time in jail. And I'm not going to name names, but some of these guys didn't care. They were sort of like, well, what else are they going to do to me? So those guys didn't care. But there were others who did not have that same kind of elite status, who were much more concerned about this. And so that's why I allow for the preservation of a certain amount of anonymity for those people, those oral histories that I collected, and I keep the database myself personally of the names. If for some reason I had to, I wouldn't do it because the Senegalese state asked for it, but if another researcher specifically asked me, and I had the permission of the person in question to share their information with them or to share their testimony in this oral history that they gave for me, then I would be able to do that, right? So in other words, I have a database of all of these people. But these were the things that I tried to be very careful about and pay attention to. And look, I guarantee you things that if I was a Jola man, I would have understood better, or I wouldn't have needed an interpreter. Whenever I was doing oral history interviews, I was speaking French. And if I was speaking with somebody, usually in the village, who could not speak French, then they were speaking Jola, occasionally Wolof, although that wasn't very typical in the Casamance. But anyway, I had a local interpreter for me who worked with me. And so I would state the question in French, and then it would be translated into Jola. Quite often, the interviewee understood a lot of the French that I was saying anyway. And occasionally some of them answered in French, but a lot of them answered in Jola. And then my research assistant would then help me translate all of that testimony later. So, of course, there are going to be probably gaps and probably some errors and things like that in that translation, and going from that ethnographic kind of research to actually being in the book. But I did the best that I could to certainly not to endanger anybody that was willing to speak with me, and to also follow the rules and regulations that were established by, again, the Cornell Review Board for Human Subject Research, that also informed a lot of that research that I was doing. So, like I said, if it was somebody like Father John McCoon's brother who I talked to, again, these people didn't mind. They're sort of like, hey, the Senegalese state knows about me anyway. There's not going to be anything new here. So, but yeah, I did try to pay attention to that. And I hope that the point of view that I brought as a Western diplomat, and kind of coming from outside, but like a kind of a more neutral position, right? To listen to both the Senegalese, because I did talk to Senegalese military officials and gendarme officials as well for the bug. So I wasn't taking sides, and I tried to be as neutral as I possibly could, understanding to some extent that that's not necessarily theoretically possible, but or in practice anyway, not possible. But I did try to be, and also just to be honest about my limitations, right, and about my positionality. I mean, I feel like that's the least that I could do in this situation. But I do hope that, and I think for the most part, the reception that the book has had from other Senegalese and Casamance, I would hope that people would recognize themselves in the book and feel like I'm helping to honor their history and bring them dignity in some way with the book.
Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned something very important, needing protecting the human subject. That We scholars research is very important, respecting the stipulation of the IRB, especially when dealing with very sensitive topics like this one. And many of us also work on topics that requires definitely being very careful and protecting people that you speak with. So
Yeah,
yeah, that's
I would
very
imagine.
important. IRB.
Yeah, I would imagine that you have some experience with that EONMR research that you did and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, every time working with activists is also such a very sensitive and touchy topic in many places, and we have to observe those ethical and protective measures.
Right.
Thank you. All right. So this is Mark Deeds. We're talking about his book, Country of Defiance. If you do not have your copy yet, please order it. It's a great book published by Ohio University Press 2023. And Mark, this leads us to the fun questions. Yes. My favorite.
Can I just say one thing real quick about the book? By the way, it's now available open access, Ohio University Press, so you don't even have to pay for it. Just go to that open access website and download a PDF of it, and there you go. But if you want a hard copy, I think you're still gonna have to pay for that.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that information. So you can
Sure.
access it for free if you want the electronic version.
That's right.
Awesome. All right. Top three dishes, Mark, that you cannot live without.
Oh, that I cannot live without.
Yes.
Well, so when I was on this dissertation research, I asked this woman at the house that I was staying at. By the way, it was really an interesting experience. The difference between going back to Dakar as an academic researcher as opposed to being there as a diplomat, very different experience.
I bet.
But I loved it. And so anyway, I had a host family. It was a kind of a middle class Senegalese family in Dakar, and that I also had a similar connection in Ziguinchor when I was down there. And so I got I got the recipes for mafe and yassa poule from this woman that I was staying with, and came home and started making mafe and yassa poule for my kids and my family. The first time I added way too much piment. It was way too hot. We were all like sweating and crying. It was so spicy. So I like my poor family, my wife and my kids, they were my guinea pigs. But anyway,
Yeah.
eventually I worked it out and got all of the right ingredients. And anyway, I don't know what you would think, Bamba, but
So may I ask, Mark, may I ask what kind of candy did you put in it? Was it like habanero? Was it scotch bonnet?
no, just straight red chili,
Okay.
chili flakes.
Candy was so.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think you might like my mafe.
I'm not sure. All the candy you put in it.
I've been working on it, brother. So yeah, I'm thinking Mafe and Yasapule. Those are my top two. My family loves it when I make those as well. Because like my wife and kids lived in Senegal for 2.5 years with me, and so they have some familiarity with Senegalese culture as well. And then the other thing is, I love Indian food. As you tell, I like spicy food, and I have a pretty good recipe for butter chicken
Oh, cool.
that I like.
Yeah, I love Indian food as well.
Yeah.
That is so good. Okay, cool. So, butter chicken, mafe, yassa.
Yeah.
Awesome. Excellent. So, top three novels. Top three novels you've read.
Okay. Well, I don't know about recently. I was thinking,
I feel like.
uh,
Uh-huh.
well, so actually, some of these. Okay, the first one is not recently. That's Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. I mean, it's a classic. It was such an eye opener for me when I first read it, and it also, in some ways, was the beginning of building empathy for me in terms of understanding a culture that I knew nothing about. You know, so, and now I have the privilege of working with the daughter of Chinua Achebe at the Journal of West African History,
Mhm.
in Wando. And by the way, the new president of the ASA, right? Yeah. So, anyway, that's number one for me. Number two is another Nigerian novel, Half of the Yellow Sun by Chimamanda Adichie.
Mhm.
And I mean, it's kind of a close tie between this one and God's Bits of Wood. But since I work on this history of separatism and secession and all of that, yeah, I thought that Half of the Yellow Sun was really powerful in kind of illuminating the everyday costs for normal people of conflicts in a West African setting. And then number three, I'm thinking of 1984 by George Orwell.
Mm.
That's an old one.
Still very topical, yeah.
It's very apropos for the moment. So. By the way, I would love to teach. I've talked to a few colleagues here at AUC. I want to do this someday. I want to teach a history course
Mhm.
through African literature.
Mm. Oh yeah, there would be there's great material for that, honestly. So that would be a great class, no doubt about that.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I'd be glad to receive your recommendations.
Okay. Awesome.
The syllabus.
I mean, you already know a lot, Mark. You might not need my recommendations, but yeah, definitely. I think that would be there's so much material out there. It would be amazing.
Yeah.
Cool. And then the last question, top three places on your bucket list.
Oh man, this is tough. I had a 20-year career with the U.S. government before I became an academic.
So
That's what I'm trying to say. I'm
mhm.
old. I'm old.
You've had your fair share of traveling the world, so that's great.
I'm experienced, but as an
Mhm.
Africanist,
Mhm.
I really want to go to the Congo, the DRC.
DRC, okay.
Yeah. I haven't really been like that's the one region of the continent I haven't been to.
Mm.
Since
Central Africa, yeah.
yeah, I've been to every other region of the continent, but not Central Africa.
Okay.
But even with West Africa, I still I haven't been to Nigeria or Ghana. You're gonna have some listeners who are like gonna hunt me down and shoot me now. But I also haven't been to Kenya or Uganda. And the reason I really want to visit these places because I teach about them so much.
Yeah. So okay, if you had to pick three of those places, now I mean now we have DRC.
Yeah.
So which other places would you add to your top three?
Well, I mean, my top three. So, beside that's a tough question. If I had to just limit for African countries, I would say Congo, Nigeria, Ghana.
Okay.
But I also want to go to China um, to visit Beijing, or I've been to Hong Kong before, but I'd love to go back and go to Beijing, just because of the role that China is playing. I mean, I've never been to Russia either. I'd love to visit Moscow someday.
Okay.
And then the only continent that I haven't been to, believe it or not, is South America.
South America. Okay.
Yeah, so like Colombia and Argentina. Yeah, I'd love to go to one of those
Okay.
places or both.
All right. I think you gave me 10 places, but you know,
Well, man, I'm not done proud yet, Bob.
I think so. Do you ever think of becoming a diplomat again?
So I really love what I'm doing. I love this job at AUC. Sometimes I wish I could do it in America, closer to family and stuff like that. But I feel like it's such a privilege
Yeah.
to be here and to be in this field where
Mhm.
people like you and Wando and others in the field. You know, my Africanist advisors of Cornell, Judy Byfield and Sandra Gray.
Mhm.
Well, and Ziad Fahmy. I mean, Egypt's part of the continent too.
Yeah, great scholars, all of them. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I'm sure they are very lucky to have you, and we are lucky to have you as part of the Africanist community. So,
Thank you, my friend.
yeah,
Thank you. I
yeah.
appreciate that.
All right. And on that note, Mark, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to see you and talk with you. And
You too, Papa.
thank you for coming to The Africanist to talk about your wonderful book, A Country of Defiance. We hope that we will have the opportunity to invite you back on this podcast.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Inshallah. All right. Well, on that note, thank you all, our listeners, for tuning in. This was the Africanist Podcast with Dr. Mark Deets. We'll give you a rendezvous for another episode with another special guest. In the meantime, as usual, stay safe and healthy.
Luttons pour la paix. Kon jamu Afrika mom lay ñaan. Mané jamu Afrika moy suñu natangue.